For decades, Russia sold the world a myth of an impenetrable shield, a defense system so advanced, so layered, that no more enemy could ever cross it. At the center of this promise stood Russia's air defense network, one of the most expensive and complex military systems ever built. Billions of dollars poured into radar stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, electronic warfare units, and command centers designed to detect threats hundreds of miles away. According to the Kremlin, the system could threat stealth aircraft, intercept cruise missiles, and neutralize drones before they even reached Russian airspace. And nowhere was this protection tighter than inside Putin's so-called protected zones. These areas weren't just military targets, they were symbols of power. Strategic infrastructure, high-value command hubs, locations the Russian state believed were completely off-limits. Russian military doctrine was clear: if these zones were ever breached, it would signal a catastrophic failure of national security. For years, state media reinforced this image. Animated simulations showed incoming threats vaporized mid-air. Generals boasted that Russia's defenses were superior to anything NATO possessed. The message to the world was simple: Russia is untouchable. But war has a way of exposing illusions. Behind the propaganda, cracks were already forming. Aging equipment, overconfidence, a rigid command structure that underestimated its opponent. Ukraine, dismissed as weaker and desperate, was quietly studying these systems, learning their patterns, their blind spots, and most importantly, their weaknesses. And when the moment came, the untouchable system would be tested in a way it was never prepared for. Because what happens next isn't just the story of an attack, it's the story of how a billion-dollar shield failed when it mattered most. While Russia projected strength, Ukraine was doing something very different. There were no more parades, no more public threats, no more dramatic announcements. Instead, Ukraine prepared in silence. After months of facing overwhelming firepower, Ukrainian commanders understood one hard truth: they could not win by matching Russia weapon for weapon. They had to outthink it. Deep inside underground command rooms, analysts studied Russian air defense behavior, radar activation times, patrol schedules, response delays. Every system, no matter how expensive, followed patterns. Ukraine's greatest weapon wasn't size, it was adaptability. Using a combination of domestically built drones, modified Western technology, and real-time intelligence, Ukraine began designing an operation that relied on precision, not force. Cheap drones were turned into strategic tools. Decoys were used to confuse radar operators. Flight paths were mapped to avoid detection zones. Western intelligence support satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, and early warning data helped fill in critical gaps. But the execution, that was Ukrainian. This preparation took months. Every variable was tested. Every failure was analyzed. The goal wasn't destruction alone, it was exposure. To prove that Russia's most protected systems could be reached, the red lines drawn by the Kremlin were, in reality, illusions. And perhaps the most dangerous advantage Ukraine had was Russia's arrogance. Russian defenses expected traditional threats: jets, missiles, large formations. They did not expect innovation from a country they had underestimated since day one. By the time Russian commanders realized something was different, Ukraine had already moved into position. The strike itself would last minutes, but the planning behind it was a masterclass in modern warfare. The strike began without warning. No more air raid sirens, no more massive missile launch, just a quiet signal, and then movement. In the early hours, when Russian defenses were operating on routine mode, Ukrainian drones crossed invisible lines that were never meant to be crossed. Flying low and fast, they blended into the background noise of radar screens already cluttered with false signals. Russian operators hesitated. What they were seeing didn't match any known attack pattern. Seconds mattered. Decoy drones triggered the first response, pulling missile batteries away from their true targets. Radar systems lit up, then suddenly went dark. Electronic warfare units, designed to jam enemy signals, were overwhelmed by coordinated interference. Then came the real strike. Precision drones slammed into keynotes, radar arrays, command vehicles, and missile launch systems, assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars each. Some never fired a single shot. Others were destroyed while still tracking phantom targets. Within minutes, the protected zone was exposed. Russian commanders scrambled for answers. Orders overlapped. Communication lines failed. A system built for large-scale cold war battles collapsed under a small, intelligent assault. By the time defensive protocols fully activated, it was already over. Satellite imagery later confirmed the damage. Craters where radar stations once stood, burned out missile platforms. A defense network that had taken years to build neutralized in moments. This wasn't chaos, it was control. Ukraine had proven something unprecedented. Modern wars are no longer decided by the size of an army or the price of its weapons, but by who adapts faster. And for Russia, the message was devastating. If Ukraine could breach this zone, then nowhere was truly safe anymore. Inside the Kremlin, the mood shifted from confidence to disbelief. At first, Russian officials denied everything. State media went silent. Then came vague statements: minor damage, no more strategic losses, everything under control. But behind closed doors, panic was spreading. This was not supposed to happen. The destroyed systems were not ordinary battlefield assets. They were part of Russia's inner defensive ring designed to protect high-value zones and symbolize absolute control. Their failure wasn't just a military setback. It was a political disaster. For Vladimir Putin, the breach struck at the core of his power. For years, his authority rested on one promise: security. The image of a leader who could protect Russia from any threat, foreign or domestic. Now that image was cracking. Emergency meetings were called. Commanders were questioned. Intelligence agencies scrambled to determine how Ukraine had slipped through undetected. Someone had to be blamed. Within days, quiet dismissals followed. Officers were reassigned. Investigations were launched under the cover of routine evaluations. Public accountability was avoided, but internally, trust was shattered. And the damage wasn't limited to hardware. Russian elites began asking questions they had never dared to ask before. If Ukraine could reach these protected zones, what about Moscow itself? What about Putin? In tightly controlled regimes, perception is everything. And this strike exposed vulnerability, something the Kremlin could not afford. Putin's response was swift but calculated. Rhetoric hardened, threats escalated, military spending increased, but the confidence was gone. Because once the illusion of invincibility is broken, it can never fully be restored. And from that moment on, Russia wasn't just fighting Ukraine on the battlefield. It was fighting fear inside its own walls. The impact of the strike didn't stop at Russia's borders. Within hours, defense analysts across Washington, Brussels, and London were reviewing satellite images frame by frame. What they saw forced a re-evaluation of modern military doctrine. A smaller nation had just outmaneuvered one of the world's largest and most expensive defense systems. Inside NATO headquarters, the message was clear: this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a warning. For decades, global security strategists had relied on layered air defense, high-cost missile systems, and centralized command structures. Ukraine's operation proved those systems could be disrupted by cheaper technology, smarter coordination, and real-time intelligence. Military experts called it a turning point. News outlets labeled the strike as a humiliation for Moscow. Headlines questioned the reliability of Russian defense export systems sold to allies across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. If Russia's own defenses could fail, what did that mean for everyone else using them? Financial markets reacted too. Defense stocks fluctuated. Governments quietly reassessed procurement plans. Some nations paused negotiations for Russian military hardware altogether. Meanwhile, Ukraine's reputation transformed overnight. No more longer just a nation defending itself, Ukraine was now seen as an innovator in modern warfare. A case study in adaptability. And perhaps most importantly, the psychological balance shifted. Fear, once concentrated in Kyiv, began moving east. For the first time, Russia's adversaries realized something powerful. Modern wars aren't won by the biggest budget, they're won by those who understand the battlefield of the future. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.